Greetings, productive programmer, and congratulations. In the last lesson, you learned how to use simple forms inside of Pheonix LiveView, and you now can pass an arbitrary value to this Add More button, and that event will be handled inside of our Add in More handle event on our form submission. But we talked about two use cases that we wanted to address, which is what if we enter an empty value here and we click Submit? Well, we actually get an error. And that's because we're getting this no match of right-hand side. We're getting an error on line 27. And that's where we have our integer parse taking place. And we can only parse a number, a valid number. So we are getting an error because the empty string is not a valid value that can be parsed. So in order to fix that, we can expand our Elixir code to handle a case here. So the reason that I refrained from this before is because it can be a little bit more intimidating if you're new to Elixir. So I want this to be very easy to absorb. You'll actually see that it's quite simple now that you've seen the first part of this done on its own. And now you also understand the importance of why we need to do this case here. So what we can do is we'll set up a case now, and this case will handle our integer parsing. So we're going to move that in here into our case, and we can get rid of this old code. And so when we parse this, it's going to be a case. That means that we're going to compare the results. So either we get the same value that we did before, where we capture the number and the underscore. So if the result of running this integer parse comes back and it matches the number and it has a remainder, then what we can do is we can just send the number back. And this is how you return something from a case. And the way that you capture what you're returning is you assign it to a variable. So we can just call this amount to add by, and we will assign to this variable this number that is returned if there is a valid matching result that has a number. And again, we're just ignoring the remainder. Now, the alternative of this, you can see what we got back in this case is instead of getting a number back, we got this atom that is an error. So the way that we can do this is we can also pattern match for if there's an error. So the way we do that is we just pattern match to see, does the result for the integer parse, when we call it, does it return an error? If it does, then what we're going to do is we're just going to return a default value of 0. And so this will handle the two use cases of either capturing the number that is parsed or an error. So that way, if there's an error, we just store 0 inside of this variable here. Now we're getting these squiggly lines because we're not using this variable yet. It says variable amount to add by is unused. So we're going to take that and we're going to put that here where we originally had plus number. So we're going to do socket assigns number plus amount to add by. So we'll save that and we'll come back to our application. And so now we can add numbers just like we could before. And if I enter nothing here and I try to add it, it's going to assign the value 0. And that just prevents our application from breaking. And just to make that make a little bit more sense, let's say, what if I try to add it by value 3? So if there's an error, we're going to add by value 3. So what I'll do is I'll add 7 here to this form initially, and then I'll set this to 0. Since we have it set to default to remap the return value to 3 here to our value inside of our variable, when we hit add more now here with nothing entered into the input field, we should have 3 get set to the default and add to amount by, and that'll get added to our number. So let's try that. And so now you can see that 3 was added to the previous value and we end up with a result of 10. So I'm basically just setting it up so that if there's an error, we handle that use case. And if there's an error and somebody does not enter anything into our form, we really don't want to add anything to the number. We just want to keep the number the way it is. So to prevent our code from breaking, we'll just add 0 to the existing amount. And then so you can see that an empty value here will not break the application. Now there's one more thing that I'd like to show you with this form. So there's two ways you could use a form. So a lot of times when you have an HTML form, you either want it to be reset to the default values, such as ours is, where it's always being set back to 7. But sometimes you also want to leave whatever the last value is. So if I enter 3 here, and I click add more, I'd like to have it stay by the amount that I'm adding. So what if I wanted to add by 3s? Well, I can't do that now. So how can we fix that? Well, it's really easy. What we can do inside of our Pheonix LiveView application, we can just redefine the form parameters. So just be very mindful of where you place your cursor here inside of where you're copying and pasting this form. And we are just going to redefine this form down here where we have our submit add amount event handler. So I'll go ahead and I'll add that right here. But instead of resetting the default amount to 7 every time, we're going to take the amount that was just added by, and we are going to put that variable inside of here in place of 7. So this way, every time that the form is submitted, we will reset it to the value that was just entered. So if we come back here to our form, the default is still 7, and that's because up here where we have the default value, I'll just reset this to 9 to demonstrate again. This default value is going to be pulled the first time that our application is mounted. So the socket mount happens anytime we load the page for the first time. But after we've loaded the page, it's up to us to maintain and take care of our socket and any of the modifications that we want to do to it. So after it's been mounted, the default value 9, we can replace that with 3 now. And if I click add more, we'll see that since we are handling inside of our form submission, we are taking the value that was just added and resetting it to the added amount default. Now when our application is updated, it'll reset that value. So now that is set to the value we just entered. So now our form can maintain the value that we just entered. So if we want to add by 3s, we can add by 3s. Or if I refresh the page here, and I want to add by 5s, I can add by 5s and it'll save the previous value. So it's up to you as a developer to decide how you want your form to function. Maybe you want yours to always be reset to the default value, but maybe you also want to have it save the previous value that was entered. And so this is a very useful thing to know when you're building your Pheonix LiveView application and you're using forms for whichever use case you need them for. So congratulations, you've just completed this form cleanup lesson. I hope you enjoyed this. And in the future lessons, we're going to continue the cleanup of our Pheonix LiveView application and teach you even more skills. So I'll see you over in the next lesson where I'll demonstrate a really cool feature that Pheonix LiveView now ships with by default. All right, I'll see you in the next lesson.